Okay, so picture this. You're in a lab surrounded by all this delicate glassware, and there's this scientist meticulously working with these tiny amounts of liquid.
Right.
It's like the classic image of a scientific discovery,
Yeah,
right?
the eureka moment.
But here's the thing that I always kind of think is so interesting. Like, what happens when a promising molecule that's found in that lab setting
Right.
needs to actually become a medicine for millions and millions of people?
Yeah.
It's such a fascinating transition.
It is. It's a pivotal moment, and, the initial breakthrough is often celebrated, but the pathway to actually making that medicine widely available involves a crucial and often unseen discipline.
Totally. Welcome to this deep dive. The learner, you shared some material that touched on this whole big picture of drug development.
Yeah.
And we thought it would be so valuable to really kind of zoom in on this one specific make or break phase, process chemistry. We're going to unpack how process chemists take a reaction that works on a lab bench and adapt it for the totally different demands of commercial manufacturing.
Right.
It's like scaling up a recipe that you perfected at home to feed an entire stadium.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It's not just about multiplying the ingredients.
No. It's way more complex than that.
For you, the learner understanding this stage is key to really appreciating the immense effort and ingenuity that goes into making medicines accessible.
It's not a simple matter of just, like you said, multiplying ingredients. It's really about tackling a whole new set of challenges that emerge when you go to that scale of production.
Absolutely. We're going to uncover some of the surprising details and the clever problem solving involved in this whole world of process chemistry.
Okay.
You've got optimizing these reaction conditions, figuring out the right kind of equipment, overcoming all the hurdles that come with making things huge.
Right.
I think there are some really interesting nuances here that most people don't realize.
I agree.
So where does this journey from small scale to large scale really begin?
Well, it usually starts with a reaction that a medicinal chemist has very carefully designed and optimized on a small scale, in the lab.
Right.
But what performs well in a small flask doesn't always translate effectively when you scale it up to a reactor that's thousands of times larger.
Yeah, in the lab, you've got such precise control, you can fine-tune temperatures.
Exactly.
You can stir things exactly as needed.
Right.
You can use all this specialized equipment. When you're dealing with these industrial-sized volumes, it's a whole different ballgame.
Totally different.
Just take something fundamental like reaction conditions.
Right.
Temperature pressure.
Right.
Mix of these behave in fundamentally different ways in large quantities.
Yeah, the physics of it changes when you go to a different scale.
So how do process chemists even begin to tackle that?
Well, they have to essentially re-engineer the reaction for its new environment.
Wow.
They have to meticulously investigate and optimize these conditions, specifically for the large-scale equipment. And there's the scientific journal called Organic Process Research and Development, or OPR&D. It's a key resource in this field.
Right.
And they provide a lot of great examples of this kind of optimization.
Oh, perfect.
We see instances where they're doing temperature screening, but they're doing it in tube reactors, which is very different from how you'd heat a small flask in a lab.
Yeah, totally different setup.
Or even something as seemingly straightforward as needing forced convection ovens for reactions that have to happen above 140 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
Because the oil baths that are commonly used in labs, they become impractical and potentially even unsafe at that scale.
I see. That makes sense.
So, it's really interesting to see how they adapt these techniques.
And it's not even just about reaching the right temperature, right? It's also about maintaining that temperature uniformly throughout a huge volume.
Exactly.
I was reading one of those OPR&D papers, and they were talking about reaction kinetics.
Yes.
And just because a reaction happens quickly in a small flask doesn't guarantee that it's going to behave the same way in a massive reactor.
Absolutely. And that has to do with the way heat is transferred in a larger system.
Right. So tell me a little bit more about that. Like, why is that such a big deal?
Well, the relationship between the surface area and the volume of the reaction mixture changes dramatically as you scale up.
Okay.
This affects how efficiently heat can be added or removed. For example, heat generated in the bulk of the reaction in a big reactor can't dissipate as quickly through the reactor walls as it does in a small flask.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So this can lead to what are called hotspots.
Hotspots.
Where certain areas of the reaction mixture get much hotter than others.
And that's bad because...
Well, it's bad because it can reduce the yield of the desired product.
Okay.
And it can even create safety risks because some reactions can become very dangerous if they get too hot.
Right. Run away.
Exactly. So understanding those underlying kinetics is crucial for process chemists to anticipate and manage these effects in larger reactors.
And that's where this deep understanding of chemistry comes in.
Absolutely.
It's not just about the practical aspects. It's about really understanding the molecules and how they're behaving.
Exactly.
And let's not overlook the role of solvents.
Right.
That seems like such a basic component.
It is.
But choosing the right solvent system is really crucial for scale-up.
It is, and OPR&D has some great examples of how the selection of a unified solvent system.
A unified solvent system, what does that mean?
It means finding a single solvent that works well across multiple steps of a synthesis.
Oh, okay.
So instead of having to switch solvents between each step, which can be time-consuming and generate a lot of waste, they find one solvent that can be used for several consecutive reactions.
Got it.
This can shorten the production time, reduce the amount of solvent needed, and increase the overall productivity.
So it's all about streamlining and making the process more efficient.
Exactly.
Okay, so you figured out the optimal conditions you found your solvent system. Now you have to actually do the reaction on this massive scale.
Right.
And that's where the equipment comes in, which is a completely different world compared to the glassware in a lab.
Totally. You go from those beautiful, elegant glass flasks you see in a chemistry lab to these huge industrial reactors that can hold thousands of liters.
Yeah.
And these are often made of very specialized materials like stainless steel or glass-lined steel.
Right.
And these materials have different properties in terms of heat transfer and chemical compatibility.
Right, because glass and steel don't behave the same way when it comes to heat.
Exactly. And they don't react with chemicals in the same way either. So all of this can influence the reaction itself.
It's almost like the reaction itself has to adapt to its new, much larger container.
In a way, yes.
I was reading about continuous flow reactors and microreactor technology in some of the OPR&D papers.
Yes.
That sounds like a pretty significant shift from the traditional way of doing things in batches.
It is a shift towards greener and more efficient methodologies.
Okay, so explain that a little bit more. Like, why is that better?
Well, continuous flow reactors, particularly microreactors, allow for much more precise control over the reaction parameters because you're dealing with much smaller volumes flowing through these narrow channels. This can lead to higher yields, less waste, and it can even allow you to safely conduct reactions that might be too hazardous in large batch reactors.
Oh, I see, because you can control the heat better.
Exactly. If a reaction generates a lot of heat, you can more easily remove that heat in a continuous flow system, preventing a dangerous buildup.
So instead of having one big pot where everything's reacting at once, it's more like this continuous, carefully controlled stream.
Exactly. And OPR&D has examples where switching from batch to flow chemistry has actually resolved some pretty serious safety concerns and reduced the environmental impact.
That makes a lot of sense.
So it's a really promising area of research.
And it must change how you monitor the reaction as well, right?
Yes, that's right.
In a lab, you can just take a sample. But in a huge industrial setup, that's not so easy.
That's where integrated process analytical technology, or P, comes in.
PT?
Yes. At large-scale, real-time monitoring is essential. So PAT-E involves using various sensors and analytical tools right in the reactor.
Oh, wow. So it's built in.
Yes. It allows you to continuously track things like temperature, pressure, pH, even the concentrations of the reactants and products as the reaction is happening.
Wow. So it's like having a constant health check on the reaction as it's going.
Exactly.
That's incredible.
It gives you much tighter control over the process and the ability to make adjustments on the fly, which is often not practical in early-stage lab work.
Makes sense. So we've talked about optimizing conditions, the different equipment. But I'm guessing that scaling up also introduces a whole new set of problems.
It does.
That you just wouldn't encounter at bench scale.
Absolutely. We call these scale-related issues. And they can be pretty significant. Well, one of the biggest challenges is managing heat and mass transfer.
Okay, we touched on that a little bit before.
We did, and it becomes even more important at large scale. Getting heat into or out of that reaction mixture becomes much more challenging in these big vessels. If you can't remove heat efficiently from an exothermic reaction, you risk what we call a runaway reaction.
Where it gets too hot.
Exactly. Or you get the formation of unwanted byproducts because the heat is driving the reaction in the wrong direction.
And on the flip side, if you need to heat the reaction, making sure that heat is distributed evenly is a challenge.
Absolutely. You need to ensure that the reactants are uniformly mixed and distributed throughout the whole volume.
So you don't end up with some parts of the batch reacting faster or slower than others?
Exactly.
And I imagine safety becomes an even greater concern when you're dealing with tons of chemicals.
Oh, absolutely. The potential hazards increase significantly with scale.
Right.
Especially when you're dealing with chemicals that are reactive or flammable.
Yeah.
There's an interesting example in OPR&D where they were looking at the residues left over after a distillation.
Okay. The stuff you usually just discard.
Exactly. They used techniques like DSC and ARC.
DSC and ARC.
Yeah, differential scanning calorimetry and accelerating rate calorimetry to analyze these residues.
Yeah.
And they found that they could undergo exothermic decomposition.
Exothermic decomposition meaning?
Meaning they release a lot of heat when they break down.
Okay.
And this could happen at surprisingly low temperatures.
So even the stuff you think is harmless could be dangerous at a large scale.
Exactly. Which is why you need specialized safety protocols.
Right.
Equipment like pressure relief systems.
Okay.
And very rigorous control of the operating conditions.
Wow. It's amazing how many things you have to think about.
It is.
So we've talked about safety.
Mm-hmm.
What about the actual drug substance itself?
Right.
Does scaling up ever affect its purity?
It can. Sometimes scaling up can lead to different types and amounts of impurities forming. This can happen because of subtle shifts in reaction kinetics or the emergence of minor side reactions that weren't really a big deal at lab scale.
I see.
So the purification methods that worked well for small batches might need to be completely reevaluated and adapted for the larger quantities.
Because you're dealing with different impurities now.
Exactly. You need to make sure that the final drug substance still meets those very strict quality standards required for pharmaceuticals.
And are there ways to deal with that?
Yes, there are. OPR&D has lots of examples of where purification techniques like chromatography or crystallization needed to be significantly optimized for large-scale production.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach?
Definitely not.
And I remember reading something about different physical forms a drug can take.
Right.
You mentioned polymorphs earlier.
Yes, different polymorphs of the same drug molecule can have different properties, like solubility, stability, even how they behave during manufacturing.
So the form that works well in the lab might not be the best for large-scale production?
Exactly. So process chemists need to ensure that the chosen solid form is robust and reproducible at commercial scale.
That's fascinating. So it's not just about making more of the drug.
Right.
It's about making sure it has the right physical characteristics at that larger scale.
Precisely.
And I can only imagine there are some very practical, almost mundane issues that can arise just from working with much larger equipment.
Oh, there are definitely some practical challenges that you don't encounter at bench scale.
Like what?
Well, OPR&D even mentions things like potential clogging in continuous flow reactors.
Clogging? How does that happen?
If you have even a small amount of solid particles forming during the reaction, they might not cause any problems in a lab flask, but they could easily block those narrow channels of a flow reactor at an industrial scale.
Oh, because the space is so much smaller relatively.
Exactly. So you might need to adjust the reactor design or the process parameters to prevent that.
So it's like every little detail matters.
It really does.
It's amazing how many different angles process chemists have to consider.
It's a very multifaceted field.
It's not just about the chemical transformation itself.
Right.
It's about engineering safety, purity.
Yeah.
Even the physical properties of the final product.
Exactly. It all comes together in process chemistry.
And I think it would be really helpful to look at some specific examples from the OPR&D literature.
I agree.
To really illustrate these challenges and the solutions that have been developed.
Absolutely. Let's delve into some real-world examples of process chemistry in action.
Okay, so what are some instances where you've seen process chemistry successfully tackling these scale-up challenges?
Well, we already talked about switching from batch to flow chemistry.
Yeah.
There was one really interesting case in OPR&D involving a formylation reaction.
Formylation?
Yeah, it's a common reaction in organic chemistry.
Okay.
The original batch process for this reaction was kind of risky.
Okay.
And it generated a lot of waste.
Mm-hmm.
By switching to a continuous flow approach for the formylation step, they were able to make the process much safer and more environmentally friendly.
So that's a win-win.
Definitely a great example of how a creative approach can lead to substantial improvements.
What other examples come to mind?
Well, there are a lot of cases where optimizing the reaction conditions was key.
Okay.
For example, there was one reaction involving a carbon-nitrogen bond formation.
Okay.
And when they tried to scale it up, they ran into problems.
Like what kind of problems?
They were getting low conversion rates.
Meaning not all the reactants were being converted to product.
Right.
Yeah.
And they were getting a lot of unwanted byproducts.
Which then makes purification harder.
Exactly, and more expensive.
Right.
But by carefully tweaking the base and solvent system,
Okay.
they were able to significantly improve both the yield and the purity of the product at manufacturing scale.
So it's really about fine-tuning those details.
It is, and those details can make a huge difference when you're producing large quantities.
Right, because a small inefficiency at lab scale
Exactly.
becomes a big problem at manufacturing scale.
Exactly. It all multiplies.
What other cool examples are there?
Well, there's also a lot of work being done on developing continuous flow processes for multi-step syntheses.
Oh, wow. So instead of doing each step separately,
Right.
you're making it all flow together.
Exactly. The reaction mixture just flows seamlessly from one reactor to the next.
That's amazing.
It's a very efficient approach.
Yeah.
It reduces the need for manual handling and purification between steps.
So less time, less waste.
Exactly.
It's pretty impressive.
It's like a miniature chemical factory.
I love that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
So it seems like process chemistry is all about finding these clever modifications and optimizations to make the process more robust and efficient at a large scale.
Exactly. It's about taking what works in the lab and translating it to the real world of manufacturing.
And it's not always a straightforward path, right?
No, it's often an iterative process.
Meaning
you try something, it doesn't quite work.
Right.
You analyze the problem, you come up with a solution, you try again.
So it's a lot of trial and error.
In a way, yes, but it's very informed trial and error.
Right. You're using your knowledge of chemistry and engineering to guide those experiments.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's step back for a second.
Sure.
It sounds like process chemistry is this absolutely essential but often unseen step in the journey of making medicines.
It is. It's the bridge between the discovery of a promising molecule and the ability to actually produce it on a scale that can help people.
And it's far more than just making larger amounts of something.
Right.
It's about fundamentally adapting and re-engineering these chemical reactions to meet the very different demands of commercial manufacturing.
And it requires a very specific skill set.
Right. So what kind of skills does a process chemist need?
Well, they need a deep understanding of chemistry, of course.
Okay.
But they also need a strong foundation in engineering. They need to be aware of safety considerations, and they need to be very good problem solvers.
Because every time you scale up,
right,
you're going to encounter new problems.
Exactly. And you need to be able to think on your feet and come up with creative solutions.
And that's what those real-world examples from OPR&D show us.
They do. They highlight the ingenuity and the meticulous attention to detail that characterizes this field.
So for you, the learner, I hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for the complexity of drug development.
I hope so, too.
It's not just about finding a magic bullet in the lab.
Right.
It's about all the steps that come after that.
Absolutely.
To make sure that that drug can actually reach the people who need it.
It's a team effort, for sure.
And it's a reminder that while the initial drug discovery often gets all the attention, it's the process chemists who really make those breakthroughs a reality.
I like to think of them as the unsung heroes of the pharmaceutical industry.
That's a great way to put it.
They take those initial discoveries and turn them into something tangible, something that can actually help people.
It's really amazing when you think about it.
It is.
And it makes you wonder what other scientific disciplines play these equally vital but less visible roles.
Yeah. What other unsung heroes are out there?
And considering all the intricate steps and problem solving we've talked about,
Right. Yeah.
what questions does this raise for you, the learner, about the accessibility and the cost of medications?
That's a good question to ponder.
Because all of this effort, all of this expertise,
right,
it doesn't come cheap.
No, it doesn't.
So it's something to think about.
Definitely something to consider.
Food for thought.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, The Learner.
It was my pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
Until then.